You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
In 2015, a decorated US Air Force loadmaster receives sudden transfer orders to a remote black site in the Middle East, one that officially doesn't exist. What begins as a routine logistics assignment quickly unravels into something far more sinister, involving strange convoys, unexplained cargo, and an operation so secretive it's erased from all official records. As he pieces together what's really happening at this isolated base, he discovers a terrifying truth that defies everything he thought he knew about his country and reality itself. If you're into true-sounding horror stories, military conspiracies, and dark secrets the government definitely doesn't want you to know, subscribe to Soul Studios, because the next story we tell might explain why some people vanish without a trace. I crouched low behind a stack of metal cargo crates, my heart thudding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The desert night was deathly quiet, except for the distant hum that vibrated in my bones. Under the harsh floodlights ahead, I saw a line of terrified civilians being herded across the tarmac by armed guards with no insignia on their uniforms. These people, men, women, even children, stumbled forward, their wrists bound, eyes blindfolded. A few whimpered or begged, only to be shoved roughly onward. My mouth went dry as I watched, frozen in disbelief and horror. Then it appeared. From the starless sky above, a massive black shape descended in absolute silence. It was as if a piece of the night suddenly decided to drop down to Earth. The object had no visible markings or lights. It was a void, an outline of deeper darkness against the midnight blue. I felt a sudden pressure in the air, a static charge that raised the hairs on my arms. Without a sound, one by one the civilians began to rise off the ground. I could see them struggle, legs kicking in panic, their screams caught in their throats. They were being pulled upward, straight up, toward a gaping opening beneath that hovering black craft. It was like watching livestock get hoisted into a slaughterhouse truck, utterly helpless, lifted like limp dolls into the belly of something unknown and terrible. I wanted to shout, to rush out and stop the insanity, but fear kept me pinned in place. My instincts as a staff sergeant told me to follow orders and stay hidden, but every human part of me was screaming that this was wrong. Evil, even. My breath caught in my throat as the last of the victims was swallowed by the darkness above. In the suffocating quiet that followed, I realized I had stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. And in that moment, crouched in the cold sand and shadows, I knew my life would never be the same. Rewind to a few weeks earlier. I'm Staff Sergeant Cole Marlowe of the US Air Force, a seasoned loadmaster with 10 years of service under my belt. By 2015, I thought I'd seen it all. Cargo runs into war zones, emergency supply drops in hurricane-devastated towns, even the occasional top-secret equipment transport where I'd been told not to ask questions. My job was to ensure whatever needed moving got loaded right and made it safely to its destination. I took pride in that. I believed in the mission, in protecting my country and maybe making the world a bit safer. Never once did I imagine those values would be turned upside down. That ordinary morning at Dover Air Force Base, I was going through pre-flight checklists for a routine logistics flight when a sealed manila envelope landed on my desk. "Change of orders," my commanding officer said, looking as surprised as I was. Inside, I found transfer papers assigning me to something called Zone Vanta in the Karstan Basin, effective immediately. I had never heard of Zone Vanta, and the location sounded like nowhere I knew. The orders were marked "Top Secret Eyes Only" in bold red stamp. My CO gave me a long, searching look. "Apparently you've been requested by name, Marlowe. Higher ups say jump, we jump. You leave at 0500 hours tomorrow. That's all I know." I opened my mouth to ask questions, but he cut me off with a shake of his head. "Don't even bother, Sergeant. I've got no answers. Just do us proud." He lowered his voice. "And Cole, be careful." That last part sent a chill of unease through me. Be careful? I packed my duffel bag that night with a strange mix of excitement and dread swirling in my gut. On one hand, being singled out for a secret assignment felt like a badge of honor. Maybe I was going to support some elite special ops mission or test cutting-edge tech. On the other hand, everything about this was outside normal protocol. No briefing, no prep, just go. I called my dad to say I'd be out of contact for a while on a mission. I hated lying to him, but it was all I could say. By dawn, I was on a military transport plane, destination unknown, heading into the biggest mystery of my career. After a long, silent flight halfway around the world, I stepped off a C-17 into blinding daylight and a wall of heat. The air tasted of dust and jet fuel. All around was nothing but endless beige desert and distant, jagged mountains. "Welcome to Zone Vanta," muttered a stone-faced man in sunglasses as he checked my clearance and ID. He didn't wear a standard uniform. His fatigues were plain, no name tag, just a patch with an unfamiliar emblem. A black circle on a field of grey. Black site, I realized. The kind that officially doesn't exist. The base itself was mostly hidden. I saw a few low concrete structures half buried in the desert ground, camouflaged with sand-coloured netting. There was no welcome tour, no time to acclimate. I was the only newcomer as far as I could tell. A terse lieutenant colonel with cold eyes met me outside what looked like a makeshift command centre. He introduced himself simply as Colonel Davis, though something about his flat tone made me doubt that was his real name. Without shaking my hand, he said, "Sergeant Marlowe, follow me." Inside, the command centre was dim and humming with electricity. The colonel led me down a hallway past a series of thick doors. I noticed surveillance cameras everywhere and keycard locks on every door. People behind those doors glanced at me as I passed, quick, sidelong looks. It felt like walking through a prison where I was the odd man out. In a small office, Colonel Davis finally spoke at length. "Your record is exemplary," he began, flipping through a file with my name on it. "We need a loadmaster with your experience for a very sensitive logistics operation here at Zone Vanta. You will not speak of anything you see here to anyone, during or after your assignment. You will perform your duties and follow orders to the letter. Do you understand?" His eyes bored into mine. I swallowed hard and said, "Yes, sir." He handed me a clipboard with a non-disclosure agreement and a stack of forms that basically signed my life away. My head was spinning. The gravity in his voice, the secrecy. It was beyond any mission briefing I'd ever had. As I scrawled my signature on page after page, a thought nagged at me. What the hell have I gotten into? My first days at Zone Vanta were eerily uneventful. I was put on standby, waiting for instructions that didn't come. I spent hours in the tiny bunk they assigned me, or pacing the sparse rec room where a television played old DVDs on mute. No phones, no internet. They had confiscated all personal electronics upon arrival. Cut off from the outside world, I felt like a ghost or a prisoner. Yet I was expected to be ready at a moment's notice for something. Sometimes I'd wander to the small mess hall for coffee. The few others I ran into, maybe 24 personnel total on base, spoke in hushed tones and clammed up when I approached. It wasn't hostility exactly, but it was clear they weren't going to be chummy with the new guy. I remember one evening trying to chat with a medical officer I found sitting alone. I asked innocently, "So, Doc, what do you think of this place?" He lifted his eyes, gave a tight shake of his head and muttered, "Don't. Just do your job and keep your head down." Then he stood up and left without another word, leaving me staring into my coffee, heart pounding slightly. At night, the base took on a different atmosphere. The silence out here was unlike anywhere else I'd been. No distant highways, no city lights, not even the cry of a coyote. Just an oppressive quiet under a blanket of stars. I started noticing that at seemingly random times, usually very late, there would be a flurry of activity. A convoy of trucks would roll in through the main gate, engines low and rumbling. If I looked out from the barracks, I could see figures moving in the floodlights, unloading large rectangular containers. Twice I was abruptly ordered to stay in my bunk during these events, with no explanation. Of course, that only made my curiosity and dread grow. One sweltering night, unable to sleep, I cracked open the door of my quarters when I heard vehicles approaching. I saw a line of green transport trucks under the floodlights, their tarps flapping. A handful of soldiers, again with those blank uniforms and no identifiers, were offloading what looked like big metal shipping containers. Even from a distance, something felt off about it. The way they handled those containers, so carefully and yet so urgently. And I could swear I heard thumping. Faint, irregular thumps from inside one of them, as if something or someone was knocking, trying to get out. My gut turned. I quietly closed my door before anyone caught me watching. The more I observed, the more certain I became that Zone Vanta was hiding something massive. I started snooping in whatever small ways I could without raising suspicion. During my shifts, I volunteered for any errand or task that might give me a peek behind the curtain. One afternoon, I was sent to deliver a supply manifest to the airfield operations office. As I walked by the main hangar, a huge structure that was usually sealed shut, I noticed the hangar door was slightly ajar. 2 armed guards stood out front, but they were engrossed in conversation and didn't notice me approach from the side. My heart drummed in my ears. This might be my only chance. I pretended to fumble with some papers as I edged closer to the gap in the hangar door. Through the narrow opening, I caught a glimpse inside the dimly lit interior, and I forgot how to breathe. Something enormous sat in that hangar, taking up nearly the entire space. It wasn't a plane, not like any I'd seen. It was circular or maybe oval with a domed top. The surface was matte black and seemed to drink in the light, like it was coated in Vantablack or some material that made it almost invisible in the shadows. I saw no seams, no rivets, no wings or tail, just a giant dark mass. As I watched, mesmerized, a couple of figures in lab coats walked along a catwalk near the top of the craft. They looked tiny next to it. One of them was holding a tablet and pointing at something on the hull. This thing, whatever it was, appeared to be under study or maintenance. Was it one of ours? Some experimental stealth aircraft? It had to be, I told myself. But a voice in the back of my mind whispered what I didn't want to hear. This didn't from any hangar in America. This felt different, otherworldly. Suddenly, a hand clamped on my shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin. One of the guards had finally noticed me. "Lost, Sergeant?" he barked, his face hard. I stammered an apology, saying I was just dropping off paperwork and must have taken a wrong turn. His narrowed eyes told me he didn't buy it. Without a word, he snatched the manifest from my hand and marched me away from the hangar, practically shoving me back toward the admin building. "Stay out of restricted areas," he growled. "Next time you won't just get a polite warning." I nodded meekly, but inside my nerves were on fire. Now I knew for certain something not of official record was in that hangar, and whatever it was huge. That night I lay in my bunk, mind racing over what I saw. If that craft was ours, why the extreme secrecy even from someone like me with clearance? If it wasn't ours, then who built it? My rational brain fought against the conclusion that seemed to be forming. I tried to convince myself it had to be an advanced drone or a next-gen bomber, but deep down I felt the creeping dread of an alternative I couldn't accept yet. Maybe that wasn't a human craft at all. I didn't have to wonder for long. The answer came crashing in on a moonless night about a week later. I was jolted awake by the klaxon of a base alarm. Red lights flashed in the corridor outside my quarters. I threw on my boots and rushed out, unsure if we were under attack or what. An MP was yelling, "All personnel to staging areas, now!" I joined a stream of groggy, tense soldiers heading out onto the open tarmac by the airstrip. Outside was chaos under floodlights. I saw the convoy of trucks again, this time lined up with their rear gates facing an open area beyond the hangar. About a dozen of us were ordered to form a perimeter around the site. I took my position, adrenaline surging, trying to make sense of the scene. Guards began yanking people out of the trucks. Not soldiers, these were the civilians from my nightmares. There were so many of them, maybe 50 or more, stumbling, blinking in the harsh light. I saw a middle-aged man in dusty clothes, a young woman clutching a crying child, an elderly lady who collapsed as soon as she hit the ground. Some were sobbing, others just stared in shock. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach. This looked like a mass arrest or a roundup. Were these refugees? Prisoners? None of it made sense. We were on a US base. What were civilians doing here like this in shackles? An officer I didn't recognize barked an order, and the armed guards started herding the group forward, closer to the huge open space by the hangar. A few tried to resist. I saw one teenage boy break away and sprint into the darkness, only to be violently tackled by a guard within seconds. I flinched as I heard the dull crack of the boy's body hitting the pavement. We perimeter troops were told to stand our ground and keep eyes outward, essentially making sure no one uninvited got near. But I couldn't help sneaking glances at the horror unfolding behind us. My mouth was dry as cotton. I realized my hands were shaking as I gripped my rifle, shaking with anger, confusion and fear. This is wrong. This is wrong. The phrase kept looping in my head, but I was under orders, surrounded by others who were obeying. I didn't even know who I could trust or what would happen if I stepped out of line. I felt utterly alone. Then the situation somehow got even more surreal. A low rumble resonated through the ground, making the very air tremble. The lights around us dimmed and flickered, as if power was being drained by something massive. I looked up at the sky and my heart nearly stopped. Descending from above was that same black craft I'd spied in the hangar, only now it was fully alive and out in the open. It was enormous, easily the size of a commercial airliner, but completely silent except for that bone-rattling hum. Lights from the base reflected strangely off its hull, only to be swallowed by the darkness of its surface. It hovered over us, a gigantic impossible object blotting out the stars. A collective gasp went up from the civilians below. Even some of the guards looked uneasy, shuffling on their feet. A hatch or panel on the underside of the craft slid open, revealing an oblong portal that emitted a faint bluish glow. And then a beam of shimmering light extended downward, right onto the group of captives. It reminded me of a spotlight, but dust and sand began to swirl up in twisting eddies under its glow, as if gravity itself had lost its grip. One by one, the people began rising into the air. The sobbing and pleading reached a fever pitch. They lifted off the ground slowly, unnaturally, floating upward in jerky motions like puppets on invisible strings. I saw sheer terror on their faces as they ascended. Some thrashed and screamed, others were limp with shock. The little child clutched in that young woman's arms was wailing, tiny hands outstretched toward her mother as they both were pulled higher and higher. My brain could barely process it. This was beyond anything in my reality. We weren't rescuing these people, we were offering them up. A few of the civilians closest to the edges of the beam tried to break free of its pull, grabbing at the ground or clutching desperately to others. One man actually managed to stagger out of the light's column and tumble back down onto the dirt with a heavy thud. For a split second, I had the wild urge to run to him, to drag him away and hide him. But before I could even twitch, two guards sprinted over and seized the man, forcing him back toward the now empty trucks. I caught a glimpse of one guard's face. It was pale, stricken, like even he couldn't fully stomach what he was doing. All the while, I just stood there at the perimeter, useless and frozen. Something inside me broke as I watched those people vanish into the belly of the ship. It was like every value I held, every oath I'd sworn, was being ripped apart in that beam of light. I felt tears in my eyes, hot and unbidden, but I blinked them away furiously. Soldiers aren't supposed to cry. I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted blood, struggling to keep my composure as the last victim, a barely conscious old woman, was drawn upward and disappeared. The beam of light retracted. The rumbling hum intensified for a moment, and then the craft began to rise higher, slowly at first, then faster. Within seconds it ascended into the darkness and was gone, as if it had never been there at all. The night was dead silent again. No one spoke. I realized I had been holding my breath and finally let it out in a shudder. The only evidence of what had happened was the churned-up sand and a few dropped personal items scattered on the ground. A single shoe, a torn backpack, a child's doll. In the disorienting quiet that followed, one of the officers finally barked at us to clear the area. We moved in a daze like automatons, following orders without a word. Back in the barracks, I collapsed onto my bunk, every muscle in my body trembling. I clamped a hand over my mouth, and for the first time in years I wept openly. I buried my face in my pillow to muffle the sound, terrified someone might hear. The image of those people, floating away into the sky, looped over and over behind my eyes. Each time I closed them, I saw that child reaching out. I saw the life I had known, my beliefs in duty, honor, country, crumbling apart in my hands. I knew I was complicit just by being there, by not firing my weapon or doing something. That guilt gnawed at me. But I also knew that if I had tried to intervene, I'd likely be dead, and nothing would have changed for those people. These thoughts warred in my head, offering no comfort either way. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because I fell into a fitful sleep, still in my rumpled uniform, my dreams filled with screams and that awful hum. The next morning, we were assembled in the pale dawn light by Colonel Davis. He stood before us with the same cold expression, as if the unimaginable hadn't occurred just hours ago. Last night's operation was classified at the highest level, he announced, voice echoing off the concrete. You are to forget what you think you saw. It was a drill with experimental tech, that's all. Discuss it with no one, not even each other. Dismissed. I felt a surge of anger flare in my chest. A drill? We all knew that was a blatant lie, but we just stood there, silent and numb. What else could we do? I glanced around at my fellow airmen's faces. They were blank, eyes downcast, every one of them locked in their own inner turmoil. Whether they had known all along or were as shell-shocked as me, I couldn't tell. Fear does that. It masks everything under a dull glaze. To my surprise, later that day I was informed my assignment at Zone Vanta was concluded. Effective immediately, I was to be shipped back to my original unit. No explanation. Maybe they figured I was a liability now that I'd seen behind the curtain. Or maybe the operation was complete and they had no further use for me. Either way, I didn't argue. I wanted out of that hellish place as fast as possible. They flew me out that same night. I left with only the uniform on my back and a duffel of bare essentials. They even kept my notebooks and letters, anything personal I had brought, for security reasons. As the transport plane lifted off, I looked down at the faint glow of Zone Vanta shrinking below. Part of me was afraid that black craft would suddenly reappear and snatch our plane right out of the sky. But soon, the base was lost in the darkness of the Karstan desert, and I dared to breathe a little easier for the first time in ages. Back in the regular world, everything felt different for me. I returned to a stateside base and was greeted by colleagues and family like nothing had happened. I was expected to slide back into normal life, as if I hadn't just witnessed an atrocity that defied every law of nature and man. I tried. I really did. But I was a mess, jumping at loud noises, hardly sleeping, my mind always drifting back to those desert nights. I was haunted by nightmares of people suspended in the air, screaming for help while I stood by, unable to move a muscle. Eventually, I couldn't take it. I had to tell someone, if not to stop it, at least to unburden my soul. I reached out to an old friend of mine, a retired Air Force major I've known since my early days in service. We met off base in a noisy diner to mask our conversation. My hands were shaking as I stirred a cup of coffee gone cold. Finally, in a low, trembling voice, I told him everything. I half expected him to laugh me out of the booth or call me crazy. But he didn't. He listened in grave silence, his eyes growing wider, face paler as I went on. When I finished, he let out a long breath and said, "Cole, you realize what you're saying. This is enormous." I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "I have proof. I swear it happened." I insisted weakly, though of course I had nothing but my word and a head full of nightmares. My friend looked at me with pity and fear. "You know they'll never let this see the light of day, right?" he said quietly. "And if you push it, you're a dead man, or worse." He urged me, practically begged me to drop it, for my own safety and for the safety of anyone I cared about. "These are not people you want on your bad side," he warned. "And if what you say is true, well, we might be dealing with something beyond people." He paid the check and left me there with my thoughts spinning and the diner buzzing harmlessly around me. I realized he was right. If I went to the press or up my chain of command, I'd likely be discredited, locked up as mentally unfit, or simply made to disappear in some accident. So I kept my mouth shut. I returned to duty and tried to pretend everything was normal. But how do you erase that from your mind? I kept obsessively checking the news for reports of mass kidnappings or unexplained disappearances that might hint at what I saw. There were plenty of missing persons if you looked for them, but they always got explained away: lost hikers, bus accidents, political conflicts, you name it. Deep down, I knew the truth. Those people taken at Zone Vanta were never coming back, and they were probably far from the last. It's been years now, and I'm no longer in the Air Force. They probably think I've moved on, that I'll stay silent out of self-preservation. But I can't. I won't. I'm telling this story because the world needs to know, needs to question when people vanish without a trace. Because somewhere out in remote corners of the world, Zone Vanta and operations like it are still running. I suspect there are other harvest sites out there, quietly filling their human quotas under the radar, feeding whatever was in that ship. Sometimes late at night, I drive far into the countryside, away from city lights, and stare up at the sky. Every so often, I swear I can see a faint black silhouette gliding in front of the stars, or hear a faint electric hum on the breeze. Maybe it's just my imagination or residual paranoia, but maybe it's not. I've chosen to recall every horrifying detail here in case something happens to me after this goes public. If I disappear, then you know I was telling the truth. They don't want this secret out. And if you ever find yourself in a silent, empty place and notice the night getting darker than it should, if you hear that low rumble that shakes your ribs, run. Run, and don't look up, because the harvest is far from over. If you think classified military operations are just about weapons and surveillance, think again. Sometimes they're about something far worse. Cole Marlowe wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a whistleblower. He was just a man who saw the truth, and realized too late that some missions are never meant to come back from. The scariest part? They're not coming for us. We're being delivered to them.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained, and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.